crossing over here, you would be on camera.
I'll be on camera.
Just crossing over.
Okay.
If you get to the podium, then no, it's not gonna show you.
That's okay.
So what are you gonna stay here and walk over?
No, I'll walk over.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good with that?
Yep.
All right, good deal. And you're good where you're at?
Yeah, I may even go there.
Okay.
We'll get there.
All right, as long as you
I
know
appreciate
that
it. Thank
crossing
you.
that, your camera's on, okay?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, please. Court is now in session. The Honorable Joe presiding.
Thank you. Please be seated. We'll go on the record, case 1019-4091, State versus Brian Dripps. We are here for sentencing. Jessica King, Jeffrey Knight for the state, Jim Archibald, Lisa Massoff for the defendant. Mr. Archibald, are we ready to go forward to sentencing?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Dripps, just to review a few things. You were charged with murder in this case as well as rape pursuant to a plea agreement. You pled guilty to those charges. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you wish to stand by your plea of guilty to those charges?
Yes.
All right. Let's start with any victim impact statements, Ms. King.
Your Honor, prior to the victim impact statements, the state, given that Mr. Dripps indicated to pre-sentence investigators that he has little or no memory of the murder, the state would ask to present a brief factual basis prior to the victim impact statements if the court would allow that.
not sure what that accomplishes, but I don't have any objection. Mr. Archibald?
That's fine, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the following facts are derived from the preliminary hearing transcript at which Mr. Dripps was present and represented by counsel. If this case went to trial, the state would intend to prove the following facts beyond a reasonable doubt, just in brief. On June 13th, 1996, Angie Dodge was found dead in her apartment on I Street in Idaho Falls, Idaho. Angie was partially dressed and had multiple incision wounds and lacerations on her neck and torso. This included an incision that began at the left side of Angie's neck, under her jaw, below her left ear, and continued all the way across her neck to below the right ear, severing all major muscles, arteries, and veins of the neck. This incision nearly decapitated Angie. There was also a stab wound to Angie's chest and breast area that entered the chest wall. Angie's death was ruled a homicide, and it was determined based on the state of undress and the semen on Angie's body that she had been raped prior to the murder. Stab wounds on Angie's right hand showed that she had tried to defend herself from her attacker. Investigators collected forensic evidence from Angie's body, including hairs and semen. A DNA profile was created from the forensic evidence. The defendant, Brian Dripps, was questioned shortly after the homicide. He lived across the street from Angie at the time of the murder. He told investigators at that time that he had been intoxicated with alcohol and controlled substances at the time of the murder, so he did not see anything that evening and was not sure where he was or what time he returned that evening. In 2019, a genetic DNA profile was created, which in May 2019 led to Brian Lee Dripps Sr., the defendant, as a possible suspect. A surreptitious DNA sample was collected from Mr. Dripps. This sample matched the DNA profile that was created from the semen found on Angie's body. Dripps was taken into custody and questioned. Dripps ultimately admitted on video that he went to Angie's apartment on that night with the intent to rape her, that he took a knife, and that he did in fact rape Angie. Dripps admitted that he held the knife to Angie's throat during the rape and cut her throat. Dripps indicated that no other individuals were with him at the time of Angie's murder. Angie died from the loss of blood as a result of the multiple stab wounds and incisional wounds to her chest and neck inflicted by Brian Dripps, the defendant. Based on this evidence, a jury could find beyond a reasonable doubt that Brian Dripps Sr. committed murder in the first degree and rape. Specifically, as alleged in the information, a reasonable jury could find that the defendant, Brian Lee Dripps Sr., on or about the 13th day of June 1996 in the county of Bonneville, state of Idaho, did unlawfully kill and murder Angie Ray Dodge in perpetration or the attempt to perpetrate rape as charged in count 1 of the information, and that the defendant, Brian Lee Dripps Sr., on or about the 13th day of June 1996 in the county of Bonneville, state of Idaho, did penetrate the vaginal opening of Angie Ray Dodge, who resisted, but whose resistance was overcome by force or violence, as charged in count 2 of the information. Thank you.
Thank you. As the record reflects, you did plead guilty to those charges.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
All right, so your victim impact statements, Ms. King.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, do you want to introduce those?
Yes. Todd Dodge. So would you like me to list them all at first, Your Honor, or just one by one?
One by one.
Thank you, Your Honor. And Todd Dodge is the brother of Angie Dodge.
I had an assistant to come up and help me to hold the mic, Your Honor, but that's okay. Honorable Judge Toomey, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak before you today. I would first like to read a quote that I feel is relevant to today's proceedings. quote, "It's not the person refusing to let go of the past, but the past refusing to let go of the person," end quote. Author unknown. I'm going to attempt to take the last 25 years of chaos and try to turn them into a comprehensive and coherent victim impact statement. My name is Todd Dodge. I am the second oldest of 4 children, and Angie was the only sister that I had. She was 9 years younger than me, and because of our age gap, we were not close as children. I have fond but few memories of her, which I hold close to my heart. I loved her, and I painfully, mournfully wish I wasn't robbed of the chance to get to know her more deeply. Today, I long to hear her voice and see her smile. I, like many others, am a forgotten victim that has sat in the shadows, hiding my own pain, sorrow, anger, and devastation. I have participated in numerous court proceedings, driven hundreds of miles, and moved across state lines, trying to give support where I could. I have given a victim impact statement in a trial that resulted in a false conviction for the murder of my sister. Often, I was persecuted for my efforts throughout the last 25 chaotic years. It is sad to now know that those previous efforts were all in vain because Angie's voice was still silent. Your Honor, I have suffered from PTSD, depression, anger, anxiety, and antisocial behaviors as a result of the chaos of the last 25 years. I often feel like an extra in a movie as I watch another chapter of my disturbing life unfold with each new television series or news article that showcases my family and the tragic death of Angie. I have to experience again and again painful childhood memories and years full of abuse and neglect I endured at the hands of my parents. When childhood photos appear on the television screens or newspapers glamorizing our family and this horrific event, it is a complete facade and hides the reality of it all. The broadcasting of my childhood is a ceaseless and tormenting reminder of the physical and emotional scars I carry from my childhood. I am forced to remember my youth and the 8-inch scar that I wear on my back. I am forced to remember the brutal, murderous death of my sister. I am forced to endure the chaos and to mourn and grieve for her again and again and again and again. I have ached in anticipation for too many years for justice to come. Your Honor, it is justice we seek here today. Because of Mr. Dripp's premeditated actions, he sentenced me to a lifetime of hell. And so far, I have served 9,126 days. Almost 25 years. And while I suffered my sentence, he, the murderer that he is, walked free. And while he walked free, the tidal wave of chaos he left in his wake continued to destroy and scar lives. I feel that there are others that should have an opportunity to have their voices heard as his victims. Victims like myself that have been directly impacted by Mr. Dripp's murderous actions. Although he did not murder them, he took their lives from them. They are not permitted to speak today, and are mandated to sit in silence. This injustice is alarming and tragic, Your Honor. To begin, Chris Tapp should be given the opportunity to voice his nightmare to this court. At 20 years old, he received a sentence of 30 years for a crime he did not commit. He served and lost 20 years of his life because of Mr. Drips. The former jurors that convicted Mr. Tapp should also be here, all victims of a process gone bad, regular people deceived by a process that convicted an innocent man and robbed him of 20 years, forced to now live with their decision and their guilt. Their voices matter too. Michael Essry Jr. should be given an opportunity to share his story. The second man wrongfully connected to Angie's death, his ordeal lasted a horrifying 6 weeks. He and his family's privacy invaded. He will forever be tied to the chaos that has become Angie's story. Over 100 men subjected to DNA testing over the last 25 years. Their privacy was violated, their characters questioned, and activities scrutinized in the search for Angie's murder. These men are not allowed to speak before you today, but are all victims of the chaos that Mr. Drips left behind. The Idaho Falls Police Department, the initial detectives and investigators, and many other law enforcement support personnel and other individuals who spent countless hours on this case had their careers and reputations destroyed. They endure the wrath of public scorn and shame from the awful burden they carry over the incarceration of Chris Tapp. All should be here speaking of their tragedies and the torment from the chaos. Jack Dodge, Angie's father, should be here today, but he passed in 2004. Just like the picture, his memory has faded from us. His sorrow is forgotten. Jack was a retired Navy veteran who struggled with his own childhood demons, yet completed 2 successful tours in Vietnam, which produced even more demons. At the time of his only daughter's murder, he was a recovering alcoholic, finally sober. However, soon after Angie's brutal death, he began drinking again. He died a lonely, heartbroken individual. Personally, I feel Mr. Drips is the final demon that destroyed Jack and bears some responsibility for his isolation and death. The more I wrote my impact statement, Your Honor, the more I began to realize the enormity of that problem and the absolute devastation and chaos that Mr. Drips created in my life and many others via his selfish, murderous actions. He dropped an atomic bomb in the center of our family and our community. He destroyed the central core of our lives and many others when he slaughtered Angie. The enormity of his actions reached across county and state lines. The shockwaves of that chaos are still being felt to this day. I have searched in vain for adequate words to describe the devastation and chaos. Then I realized words were insufficient to demonstrate the absolute horror of the circumstances. In pursuit of these words, I realized I had lost sight of what this was really about. You see, I have the opportunity to verbalize before you today. Angie's voice was severed, cut from her body, silenced forever 25 years ago by Mr. Drips. Really, she is the one who should be here speaking, telling her story of the true suffering, brutality, butchery, murder, and rape that took place at the hands of Mr. Drips when he executed his premeditated actions. It's disturbing that in the weeks prior to Angie's death, she was fearful that someone was stalking her. An anonymous letter left on her car scared her enough she reached out to one of her brothers who drove to town to check on her. My little sister was living in fear. And then on June 13th, 1996, she was found brutally murdered and raped. And if the court will allow, and with some assistance, I ask you to permit me to display a graphic representation of the enormity of the problem. The picture represents the devastating chaos I've had to deal with the last 25 years. Your Honor, I would like to present it now. Will the court please grant permission and assistance to display this?
It's hard to know what you're gonna show me. Any objection, counsel?
Your Honor, I believe the photos have been submitted as part of the pre-sentence report. I don't know how benefit does.
Scheme?
No, I think I have not seen the photograph, but
You want-
I believe it's the same that have been provided in the pre-sentence investigation. I think it would benefit Mr. Dodge's statement.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Dodge.
Give me just a second, Your Honor.
Your Honor, it's a little sacred to us. Can I help him?
Sure.
And Your Honor, that is Roger Dodge, the brother will come next.
I would prefer if it got laid out on the floor,
Oh,
if that's possible.
I guess it's possible.
It's okay. Meet Angie, my little sister. From receiving her death notice to moving items out of Angie's apartment where this butchering took place, and more recently, the guilt of really realizing I had an encounter with Mr. Drips the day that we boxed up her things. It continually disturbs me to know Mr. Drips lived just across the street and planned this horrific event, stalking, preparing, and then executing his evil plan. He watched the chaos of the aftermath unfold, feigning innocence, while we, her family, emptied her apartment, grieving and mourning what he stole from us. The smells of the crime scene and cleaner are still thick in the air. That crime scene is speaking, Your Honor. Angie is crying out, asking you to hear her voice, to hear her words of how this crime impacted her. The size of the photo pales in comparison to the enormity of the situation and the enormity of the horrific nature of Mr. Drips' actions. He violently slit her throat from ear to ear and watched as she lay there aspirating on her own blood. The horror and pain she experienced haunts me as an older sibling, as a brother, as a human. Mr. Drips did not call for medical assistance. He did not seek out medical care so that she would be able to live. No, he did not. He raped her, and he gained control and silenced her, likely while she was laying there. He raped her. It is disturbing to scroll through Mr. Drip's Facebook posts and read that some of his friends refer to him as Sling Blade. This is before Mr. Drips was arrested. Sling Blade, the movie, ironically came out in 1996. It depicts a male that uses a knife and viciously murders several individuals. Is this just a coincidence or just another level of the chaos? Not only did Mr. Drips destroy the sanctity of Angie's life, he further destroyed my immediate family members. He destroyed my children's trust and safety of their own childhood. To this day, my older children who are reaching 30 years of age do not visit the Idaho Falls area. It is a dark reminder of where something bad happened to their aunt they never got to know. To them, Mr. Drips is the boogeyman. There is only one man that is responsible for the complete and utter destruction that has taken place. The collateral damage of Mr. Drip's actions extends far and wide. The physical and monetary devastation that has been inflicted upon us and this community is astonishing. For the last 25 years, Mr. Drips has stayed intentionally hidden from us. Mr. Drips had never intended to come forward. Mr. Drips was completely happy, living his life of lies, while those in Angie's circle swirled in chaos. He kept silent for 23 years while the chaos in our lives raged on. Had it not been for advances in forensic technology, Mr. Drips would never have been apprehended, would never have confessed, would never have come face those whose lives and community he destroyed and brutalized. He has no intention to right his wrongs, holds no remorse, offers pathetic excuses, and recently made comments to the PSI investigator that he only deserves 10 years. He continues to victimize Angie, our family, and this community. Mr. Drips is the definition of evil. He never wanted to confess his crimes to this court or take responsibility for this atrocity against us and this community. He was completely happy to sit back, retire, watch another man do time for a crime that only Mr. Drips committed. He was happy seeing our family and other families in complete ruins, devastated and torn apart by the chaos that he left behind, showing no remorse, no regret, no concern for anyone but himself. He has been the director in this real-life horror he created for us all. This past February, Mr. Drips was given the opportunity to confess his crime, to stand and allocute his guilt. Instead, Mr. Drips gave a lackluster, half-hearted, pathetic, non-committal allocution statement. He had to be prodded by the court to give additional details that still fell tremendously short of the horror and rage you can see that he delivered to my sister. He has the audacity to plead for mercy from this court, whereupon he showed Angie none. Our family, Chris Tapp, Michael Esri, and IFPD, and many, many other men, absolutely no mercy. He has the audacity to ask you to send him to a special medical unit. What special medical attention did he provide Angie? He used the excuse that he was using cocaine and alcohol at the time, which is yet another convenient attempt to excuse this horrible, premeditated crime. He provides no evidence to prove his statement. Are we to believe he was on cocaine and drunk for weeks while he stalked and insidiously planned to violate Angie? It's simply Mr. Drips, once again, downplaying and excusing himself for his role in this crime and the chaos that it ensued. It is offensive. I can look back and complain about the last 25 years. I can blame the process, the police, and the misleads, and the wheels of justice. It is nothing compared to what Angie, my little sister, had to endure that night. Ultimately, the only person that bears responsibility for this absolute chaotic destruction, loss, and pain in my life and many others is Mr. Drips. It lies solely on his blood-soaked hands. Your Honor, I beg this court to deny this plea agreement. I am not in agreement with it. I voiced my concerns to the prosecution during mediation. I was discounted. I was deceived. I was dismissed. Once again, forced to sit in the shadows, made to feel like my voice, the voice of others, and especially Angie's voice, does not matter. This plea agreement falls tremendously short of the debt Mr. Drip owes. I ask you, Your Honor, to give Angie her voice back. Give back to Angie what Mr. Drips severed 25 years ago. You are the only one that has the authority to do so. I ask that you make Mr. Drips sit for a jury trial. I ask that you allow a jury of his peers to determine his fate. If Mr. Drips can't give a proper allocution of the events that took place on June 13th, 1996, then let the crime scene speak for him. Let Angie finally have a place at the table and not on the floor. Let her speak from the grave. Let her voice be heard about the absolute brutality she suffered that night. Let the wrongs of the past be corrected so that all victims can finally live in peace. Let the true story of these horrific events finally be revealed to tell the real story that Angie has wanted told for so many years. Let her voice be heard and let the chaos end. Your Honor, thank you.
Next statement.
Roger Dodge, Your Honor, another brother of Sandy's.
I don't think I need this today. Your Honor, thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Excuse me, I do need to hear.
Oh, you can't hear me? Okay.
Turn it off, Roger.
Oh. Sorry about that. Thank you for this opportunity to speak, Your Honor. My name is Roger Dodge, Angie's older brother. 25 years ago, this was, and still is, the most devastating thing I've ever been through in my life. I consider Mr. Drips to be the very definition of evil. This is it. I know his family would probably disagree with that. You know him differently than we do. I would like to point out that had he been apprehended 25 years ago, there's a couple of people sitting in this room today that wouldn't be here. I'm not picking on them, I'm just pointing it out. His son Brian, his daughter Haley, wouldn't be here today.
I object. This is not a proper victim impact statement to point out members of my client's family.
Mr. Dodge, the purpose of a victim impact statement is to identify how this crime has affected you personally. So I am going to have to ask you to try to limit it to that.
Okay, sir. I apologize. 2 weeks before Angie was murdered, I went to visit Angie with my ex-wife, and she was pregnant. One of the sweetest things that I can remember is Angie bending over and kissing my ex-wife's belly. She could not wait for my daughter to be born. Miriam was born on the 17th. Angie was buried on the 18th. As you can all imagine, that was a very devastating week for me. And it still is. I cannot believe how long that she's been in a casket, laying in a grave she shouldn't be in. I too feel that a court hearing, a jury trial, would be more beneficial than what we've had here. I disagree with it wholeheartedly. It would be more closure, not only for myself, I think it would be justice for Angie and for this community, actually. To be robbed of a jury trial is just wrong. I don't see how else Mr. Drips could face this. I really don't. When I replay in my mind the crime scene photos that I've looked at and the morgue photos, it's indescribable. All you could want is justice for the crime. That's all you could ask for. When you look at those photos of her slit throat, blood between her legs, a large slash on her breast, knife wounds in her hands, blood on her face, in her hair, anyone in this position would want justice. This is not a mystery. Obviously, hindsight's 20/20. It was Occam's razor all along. He lived right across the street. It's absolutely unbelievable. And here we are today. Only just barely getting justice just since 2019. I find that very unbelievable. Your Honor, I'll just finish here. I want justice for my sister. She deserves that. Having the death penalty taken off the table, hey, we were supposed to be in a jury trial this week, if I'm not mistaken. I was looking forward to that. I hope that we still get that. Thank you. All right, I'm going to shut this off.
Carol Dodge, Your Honor, the mother of Angie.
Boy, what a long 25 years of pure hell Brian Drips you put us through.
Now, you're gonna have to, I can't hear you, you're gonna have to speak in the microphone.
What a long, horrible journey Brian Drips has put us through for the past 25 years. I had an impact statement prepared, but I couldn't have said it any better than my son Todd and my son Roger said it. They said it all. The pictures that are in our mind are Angie's crime scene pictures, the way you left her. The last night I saw her, just shortly hours, Brian Drips, before you brutally killed her. She was at my house. My last words to her were, "I love you." I held her in my arms. And never again did I ever get able to hold her again because of your actions, your evil actions, your selfish actions. And I can't forgive you, ever. Like I said, Todd and Roger said it all. You have shattered our family. It may have been broken before it happened, but it is literally shattered, and there is no way to pick up the pieces ever again. You, Brian Drips, deserve eternal hell. You think your pain here on earth? You better look up at me instead of looking at that table. Because you deserve eternal hell, Brian. We have to go through 25 years of pure hell trying to find justice. Looking for you. And now you have to live. Live it out. Because I'll never forgive you. And Judge Taney, it's all in your hands now. And I'm sure before you have the sentencing report in hand. Whatever you give this man is not enough. You know what's right. You know what's honorable. And if this was your child, what would you do?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Archibald, do you have any witnesses?
Your Honor, co-counsel Lisa Massif has an argument and a video presentation to present to the court. After she's completed, then I'll make a brief summary as well. But we do not intend to call witnesses. We do have a family here that has submitted statements to the court. The court can acknowledge that those statements that we presented have been read and considered by the court, and I don't need to call them.
I have reviewed those statements, all right? Go ahead.
And Your Honor, I'm sorry, not to interrupt, Mrs. Massoff. The state had argument as well. Is the court going to hear?
Yeah, we'll go to Mr. Archibald, then I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. I wasn't sure you were.
Brian made this picture with oil pastels when he was 11 years old. He was described that year by a teacher as a pleasure to have in class and considerate of others. In our presentation today, I'm going to talk about his childhood, his fatherhood, what happened in 1996, his health, and his character. Brian was born in Kirksville, Missouri in 1995. His mom was 17 and his dad was 19. The picture here with the circle 1964 is his father, Philip. He and his mother and father divorced before Brian was born, and his father never had a presence in his life. For some reason, my slideshow is not adopted by Gerald Drips when he was about 3 years old. And at age 10, Brian found out that he was adopted. He was moving back to the area with his family, and his mother did not want him to find out from someone else that he had been adopted, so he learned that his real father was Philip Usry. Philip did not want a relationship with him. When Brian graduated from high school, he called Philip, and Philip said, "I don't have a son named Brian, and I don't want a relationship with you." Philip died at age 45 of lung cancer, and throughout our investigation of Brian's paternal family, we've been able to learn very little about Philip. What we do know is that Gerald Drips continues to be a presence in Brian's life, in and out of his life, but is a presence to this day. And Gerald Drips produced with Linda, his sister, Nikki. That relationship went through divorce, reconciliation, and many moves. In these next pictures, as I show Brian growing up, you will notice that there's a map behind them. And in the map behind each one is the location that Brian was living at the time of the photo. In this photo, he was a young baby, and he was living in Kirksville, Missouri. In this photo, he's in Granville, Illinois, as a big brother to his younger sister, Nikki Drips. And here he is in Walla Walla, Washington, where Gerald was stationed before he was deployed to Vietnam. In 10th grade, Brian moved to San Bernardino, California, again so that family could be by Gerald. Brian attended high school at Eisenhower High School with 2,000 other students that year. The size of the high school was overwhelming to him. The atmosphere and the culture change shocked him and scared him. By the time he lived in San Bernardino, in this picture here, he had moved over 18 times in his young life. It was soon after graduation that Brian joined the Marines in 1984. He did basic training at Camp Pendleton and was stationed in both the Philippines and Okinawa, Japan. This picture shows the route of his travels as an adult. Brian ultimately ended up in Idaho in the early 1990s and started working in construction. He met his one and only wife, Nicole, in Idaho Falls in 1995, and they had their first child, Courtney, in 1996. By 1999, Nicole and Brian divorced. Nicole left in 1999 3 children, a 6-month-old, a 1-year-old, and a 2-year-old. She left them all behind, and Brian and his mother raised them together. To this very day, Brian does not understand why his marriage to Nicole fell apart. He never remarried. He never really got back into the dating scene. He focused on fatherhood and work. From 1999 forward, Brian made it a point to make sure his 3 kids stayed in one place. He had the help of his mother in raising his children, and he traveled back and forth from work to Caldwell so that his kids had stability. Brian showed his children what it meant to be a hard worker. Here he is on a job work site in the northern Idaho area. He was present for things like child-related graduations and special events. Here's Kaylee graduating. And he walked his daughter Haley down the aisle for her wedding. So the big question that's lurking when you look at this life is, what happened in 1996? And in 3 months in 1996, things really fell apart for Brian. On April 3rd of 1996, Nicole left Brian and he began living on I Street. He didn't have the skill set to deal with loss. He didn't know what to do. He didn't understand, and he turned to alcohol and drugs. In May of 1996, he was continuing to cope with the loss and Nicole's leaving at 8 months pregnant by drinking and drugging. And on June 13th, when the crime committed, he drank so much and closed the bars and imbibed in so much cocaine that he was peeled off the floor of the bar before he left that night. So when he reports that he doesn't have a clear memory, it's a frustrating report, but it's a very realistic report because the depths of the intoxication. And when you look at this period of time and the short window of loss between April and June, and you take the timeline and you pare it down, we're looking at a window that was a horrible, horrible window of time that was about 20 minutes on one day in June 13th. Over the years, Brian's body has literally fallen apart. He had a very well-respected career and was known as a superintendent on large concrete and heavy construction jobs. He built an addition on his mother's home. He built animal corrals. He fixed cars. But over time, all of that became impossible because of his health conditions. When you look, as I talk about this health, when you look at these slides, they're broken in the bottom shows breaking this into categories: diabetes and heart conditions, joint pain and surgery, digestive and nervous system, migraines and mental health. And in the 4 categories, there's a red line that depicts over the course of his medical records an event. As I talk about the events, I'm only talking about some of them, the major ones, but all of these slides reflect out of thousands of pages of medical records the events that have occurred in his life physically. So a first significant event is in 2005. He has a rotator cuff repair. In 2006, he has a colonectomy and is suffering from diverticulitis. And in 2010, he becomes formally disabled due to severe body pain and continued documentation of high blood pressure. In 2012, when he just doesn't understand what's going on with his body, he formally receives a diagnosis of ankylosing spondylitis, and he learns that it's a condition where the body attacks itself. Ankylosing spondylitis causes the fusing of the bones or other hard tissues and inflammation of the spinal bones or vertebrae. His doctor documents that he has one of the very most severe cases his physician has seen, and he is in excruciating pain every minute of every day. It affects every joint in his body, and it drastically impacts his mobility. It causes his hunchback and is related to many other conditions that he has. It is related to a specific gene that he has known as HLA-B27. In 2013, he has suffered a lifetime of migraines that have been treated by the Spine Institute. He has shoulder surgery and a hip replacement. In 2014 and 2015, he's treated for depression. He has a left hip replacement, knee replacement, congestive heart failure, and type 2 diabetes. And then throughout his medical records, there's a documentation of depression that he's suffering in large part with a variety of things that are going on in his body and an inability to know what is wrong and an inability to figure out anything that can potentially help him. February 2016 is a very large event in his life when he has an acute heart attack and stents are put in, and he's experiencing in that year this paralysis of his lower extremities. The other thing that was significant in 2016 is that because Brian has this real desire to be a hard worker and enjoy very much his physical labor on construction sites, building dams and sewer treatment facilities, he went to college. He went to Stephen Senator College to get a computer science degree. And in 2016, he had 98.6 credits of a computer science degree, and a bachelor's is 120 credits. So he was just short of about a year of having his bachelor's degree when the heart attack completely derailed him. In 2017 and 2018, he had very significant and frequent hospitalizations for falls. His falls were unexplained. He passed out. He continued to lose motor skills, and he had an endoscopy for severe stomach pain. And severe stomach pain and daily stomach pain is something that he suffers with to this day. In 2019, his physicians began giving him a prescription for a Remicade infusion for his ankylosing spondylitis symptoms because they were continuing to worsen. He has an infusion every 4 weeks, and it is the only thing that provides any sort of relief for his every moment of pain every day of his life. Recently, while incarcerated, he had another heart attack in November of 2020, and he had a placement of 5 stents. He also, while incarcerated, has suffered from kidney stones and had another endoscopy for severe stomach pain. So when you look at all of these variety of things going back to 2005 to current, and those are, again, are just the ones that are the highlights of a really horrible medical history. He is suffering very great degree significantly, and the 20-year sentence and agreement that we discussed takes that into consideration, that it will be almost impossible for him to outlive that 20-year sentence. And over the course of Mr. Archibald and I's representation, we've watched him continue to decline, and we have had multiple discussions about the fact that we could get a call any day that he did not make it through the night while incarcerated and in jail, because his health truly is that fragile. As the court knows, several experts, psychiatrists and psychologists evaluated him extensively. They looked at all of the medical records. They looked at all of the discovery. We provided absolutely everything that was available to these experts. And Dr. Camille Lacroix reported in her list of his diagnoses to the court that at this point in time he is taking 16 different medications, including the high amount of Remicade that he's infused with. She noted that his full list of medical diagnoses is 7 items long. And Dr. Watson, who did extensive psychological testing on Mr. Dripps and came in and spent time with him in the jail for several days, giving pen to paper tests and a lot of physical tests, noted to the court in closing he wanted the court to know just how precarious Mr. Dripps' medical condition appears to be. So a question that everybody has about this case is, given the time between 1996 and now, what was Mr. Dripps out in the community doing? Was he hurting other people? Was he doing other bad things and committing other crimes? Did he lead a life of violence? And the answer to that is no, the opposite. He led a life that was the opposite of what happened in 1996. Brian took his kids on vacation. He took them to Disneyland, and his oldest daughter, Courtney, wrote to the court, "I'm beyond thankful that I had Brian as a father. He taught me most everything I know today." Gerald Dripps, the man that he considers to be his father and calls Pops, describes that he was a good person and a good father and a good son. And Gerald Dripps is the person who had, in Brian's life, had a severe motorcycle accident and was incredibly disabled. In this picture here, he's sitting in a wheelchair, and it was Brian who helped take care of him and nurse him back to health. And to this day, Gerald Dripps is living with the family and with all of the Dripps children. So they're spending holidays together. His sister Nikki wrote to the court how stunned she was to learn of this crime, that never in her life would she believe that her brother was capable of harming someone in this manner, and that he was a wonderful brother to her, a wonderful uncle to her children, and she loves him, knowing this because the person that she grew up with, she didn't see as capable of doing this. And one of the more compelling letters was from his friend Scott Erickson, who spent hours commuting with Brian in a vehicle and spent hours working on job sites with Brian. And he wrote to the court that he and his wife just have struggled with the person that they know and the person that they spent time with, and how it could be. And Scott said to the court in his letter, I'm gonna love Brian no matter what, because the Brian Dripps that I know is not capable of what he has admitted to. It's not who he is. It was a horrible window of time in 1996, but it's not who he is or who he's been for the last 25 years. Another friend of his, Rhonda Taylor, a female, who spent many hours with Brian and hours in a car, said to the court, this is someone who never made me for a minute feel insecure or feel scared. He always made me feel safe, and I didn't think that he could do anyone like harm like this. Another good characteristic of Brian is that he's an animal lover, and you can see in these pictures throughout his life he's always had pets, and his pets are very important to him, whether it's building corrals for the horses that his children have ridden, or goats, or having dogs at his house. He is an animal lover, and animals love him. And significantly, he has had his first grandchild. His daughter Haley, who is here, had baby Jameson just a couple of months ago. And Haley wrote also a very compelling letter. And the interesting thing about Haley is that Brian is very soft-spoken, very quiet, does not use a loud voice. The way you hear him speak in court, which is softly and with few words, that's Brian's character. And his daughter Haley, his youngest, is a lot like that. But she wrote a letter about a dad who would stand in line with her for hours to wait until the next Twilight book was released, because she loved Twilight books. And he would stand in line for hours with her to get tickets to the movie Twilight as those movies were released and they could go watch them. That's the dad that she knows, and that's the dad that she wants to be a part of her son Jameson's life. Importantly, Dr. Lacroix concluded in her report for the court, after she spent hours interviewing Brian, after she spent days looking at records, after she reviewed all of the testing that Dr. Watson had done, she concluded that in the event that he lives 20 years, his lack of violent offenses, his health, his age, and his character all place him in a low risk to reoffend or ever hurt anyone else. Brian did commit one of the most serious offenses possible in 1996, but he didn't repeat it. He didn't hurt anybody else. He was a devoted son, a solid father figure, a solid friend. He kept his kids in one home, in one location, and the love and the stability that he gave to them they, in return, maintain and give back to him. And before I defer to Mr. Archibald, who has a few comments, and ultimately to Brian, who's going to talk to you, I want to express that in my 21-year career, it's been a privilege to represent him in this case. He's been cooperative. He's been collaborative. He's been honest. He's so incredibly remorseful. And he is kind. And I'm proud to stand next to him. And I encourage you to follow this plea agreement. Thank you.
Archibald, your recommendations for sentencing?
Thank you, Your prosecutors and the Dodge family were in other rooms. We reached this compromise. I'm hearing today that some of the Dodge family is not happy with the mediation agreement, and I understand that. And I want to tell the court that it was hard on our side too, that agreeing to 20 years for my client is like a death sentence. He spent 2 of those 20. Realistically, does he think he's going to get out in 18 years? He doesn't think his body's going to hold up. So it was difficult on our end to agree to 20 because he believes it is a death sentence for him. And so, sure, he wants to stay optimistic. He wants to stay positive for his children and for now his grandchild. Of course, when we reach plea agreements, because they're compromises, both sides have to give up. Both sides have to reach somewhere in the middle. And we believe that this plea agreement does that. We believe that the plea agreement follows the 4 factors of sentencing, and this court is obligated to follow that. This sentence of 20 to life would deter Brian and others from similar crimes. It would rehabilitate him, it would punish him, and it would protect society. And so it's a long time. And the court has been asked today by some of the Dodge family, and I respect them, I respect their opinions, to set aside this plea agreement. Let's go to trial. And some of the factors in going to trial were the same for us. We had a pending motion to suppress his confession. We believe the police made mistakes in interviewing Brian. That motion will be withdrawn because of this guilty plea and sentence. But if we go to trial, then we take that issue back up. We had a motion to change venue that was granted. So trial's not going to be here in Bonneville County, somewhere else. There are many more motions before we get to trial in a death penalty case. So many motions attacking the death penalty. And why? Because the death penalty is the ultimate punishment. For the state to kill a person, there's so many appeals, so many procedures. It has become so painstaking that the state of Idaho and other states are taking a good look at why do we pursue the death penalty? Justice delayed is justice denied. And I think that's some of what the Dodge family is suffering from, is the delay, the 25-year delay of justice. And so, we're asking the court to accept it, even though we compromised as well. Brian was truthful when he said, I was hoping for 10 years. Maybe he can live 8 more years before parole, but he's willing to accept 18 more because he knows that the Dodge family needs closure and his family needs closure as well. One of the interesting first things that Brian said to me when I met him 2 years ago is when we were talking about his declining health was he thought this was that his declining health was God's way of punishing him for what he did to Angie. And so I could tell the court that he has felt bad, felt horrible, felt remorseful about what happened, even though he can't remember all the details. For those of us who deal with people under the influence of alcohol and cocaine, we understand that. We understand that that's what alcohol and drugs can do, is impair your memory. So that's why, Your Honor, I'm asking the court to accept the plea agreement.
Ms. King, your recommendations?
Thank you, Your Honor. This Sunday will be the 25th anniversary of the rape and murder of Angie Dodge. Angie was only 18 years old. She had just moved into her own apartment, starting out in her young adulthood. She was enjoying time with her friends and family. She was working. Her life was really just beginning when it was tragically and brutally cut short by Brian Drips on June 13th, 1996. Drips entered Angie's home without her knowledge or permission and committed two of the worst crimes that somebody can commit, rape and murder. And not only did he commit those crimes, but those crimes were committed in a particularly heinous manner. Entering into the home of another person and attacking a sleeping and unsuspecting victim, then raping and nearly decapitating her when she tried to fight back. Mr. Drips told investigators and the PSI investigator that he remembers some aspects of the rape. He remembers the intent he had to go and rape Angie and his taking a knife to do that, but doesn't remember a lot of details of the murder. In fact, Mr. Drips told investigators that he believed Angie was still alive when he left. Now, if we're to believe that statement, this means that Mr. Drips made the conscious decision to leave Angie without calling for help, knowing that she was grievously injured, knowing that she was suffering, knowing that she very probably would die alone in her bedroom. Now, Mr. Drips has stated that he was under the influence of alcohol and cocaine at the time of the rape and murder. And there is some independent evidence, at least, to suggest that Mr. Drips was intoxicated that night. But we only have his word for the level of that intoxication. And even if Mr. Drips was voluntarily intoxicated, this does not excuse his actions and his brutal rape and murder of Angie. We know from the statements to law enforcement, the statements he's made to the court, that this was not a completely black hole of memory. He did remember some of the details. He remembered that he did rape Angie. He went over with the intent, and he did cut her. Now, several character references, as stated by the defense, were provided in support of Mr. Drips in the PSI, and defense counsel has presented a lot of information about his life and who Mr. Drips was. These references speak about Mr. Drips in glowing terms. They talk about a person who's considerate of others, a kind person, a gentle person, a loving person, a responsible and respectful person. The PSI investigator noted that it is incredibly difficult to reconcile that person that is spoken about in those letters in defense counsel's presentation with the person who brutally raped and murdered an 18-year-old girl. And definitely, it is incredibly hard to reconcile that. But what about the other 23 years? From the state's perspective, it's hard to reconcile the person in those letters, the person in the defense counsel's presentation with that 23 years as well. Because it is about 23 years between the murder of Angie and when Mr. Drips was arrested for that crime. And yet, in that 23 years, Mr. Drips lived every single day of that period of time. He lived his life in those 23 years as though he had never taken Angie's life. He lived every day of those 23 years with the opportunity to show that when sober, he is every man, every bit of that person, of that man that is described by his family and friends. He had an opportunity on every single day of those 23 years to show himself to be a man who takes responsibility, who takes accountability for his actions, even the worst one he's ever committed. He lived every day of 23 years with the opportunity to show he's so incredibly remorseful. And yet what did he do? He lived every day of those 23 years as if he had never taken a life. He lived every day of those 23 years as though another man was not sitting in prison for his crimes for 20 of those years. And Mr. Drips told investigators that he had seen videos about Angie's murder. He knew someone was serving time for his crime. And yet every day he woke up and refused to take accountability for his actions. He lived his life and kept silent about Angie's murder for those 23 years. He went on vacation with his family, got to enjoy time with his children, his mother, his stepfather, his other family members and friends. As defense counsel indicated in their presentation, Ryan was there for all the special events. So what does that tell us? That every day for 23 years, he got to enjoy that time, enjoy those special events, knowing that there was a family suffering, that there was a family, the Dodge family, who did not have the truth, who was fractured and searching for the truth and not finding it because the truth remained hidden and silent in Mr. Drips. Angie's father, Jack, didn't get to walk her down the aisle, as Mr. Drips got to walk his daughter down the aisle. Angie's mother, Carol, didn't get to smile at her at her wedding. Her brothers didn't get to be there to support her. They're all here today. You heard from two of them, Todd and Roger. Brent is also here. All three of her older brothers. None of them got to have special events with Angie. None of them got to have another 23 years of days with her. So for those 23 years, he had a truth he refused to reveal. Mr. Drips, in the state's opinion, spent those additional 23 years showing exactly who he truly is. A man who could rape and murder a young woman and then refuse to accept accountability for his actions, refuse to show remorse until after he's caught and knew it would be to his benefit to do so. Where was that remorse? That incredible remorse, while the Dodge family was suffering without answers for 23 years? Where was that consideration of others? Not just on the night of Angie's murder, when Mr. Drips indicates he was under the influence of alcohol and drugs, but on every single day for the next 23 years that no remorse was shown and no accountability taken. This was not just about 20 minutes on June 13th, 1996, though of course that started it. That's when Angie's life was taken. That's when her family truly began to fracture. But it's also about every day after that. Every day of a different character being shown. So in the state's view, Mr. Drips' actions are far from taking responsibility or showing true remorse for his actions. Now, much of the information contained in the PSI, as well as a lot of the information presented by defense counsel, focuses on Mr. Drips' current medical conditions. From the state's perspective, these certainly do not lessen the culpability of Mr. Drips' crimes committed 25 years ago. But they are relevant to the sentence, and as defense counsel indicated, into the agreement that was made during mediation. Because they do suggest that the 20 years suggested by the plea agreement, 20 years fixed, in effect is materially similar to, the same to, a fixed life sentence for Mr. Drips. And that is part of what led the state to agree to that decision in that plea agreement. That given Mr. Drips' medical issues, the state does not believe there would be a material difference between a 20-year fixed sentence and a fixed life sentence at this point. Additionally, as defense counsel indicated, though the state's evidence is strong in this case, there are always potential obstacles, motions, things of that nature, especially in a case that has gone on this long, 25-year-old case with a lot of other wrinkles in it. So the state does believe that the plea agreement reached during the mediation is fair and appropriate in this case for those reasons, and because it will be materially similar to a fixed life sentence for Mr. Dripps at this point. I do completely understand the Dodge family's difficulty with this agreement, this agreement. This has been an incredibly long and difficult journey for them. This has been delayed justice. The state was pleased that the Dodge family, Carol, Brent, Roger, and Todd specifically, were able to participate in the mediation process. But I do completely understand that this feels like coming too little, too late. This was a horrific experience for the Dodge family and continues to be so. But the state does believe that that is a fair and appropriate sentence in this case and would ask the court to follow that plea agreement. And just in conclusion, Angie's life is what we need to remember here. That is what this is about. And it came to a brutal, tragic, and far too soon in 1996, 25 years ago. And yet I think we also need to remember, as a couple of the victims brought up today, that Mr. Dripps' actions did more than rob a young 18-year-old woman of the rest of her life, of the start of her life. But those actions and Mr. Dripps' refusal to take responsibility for those for 23 years also caused lasting harm to the Dodge family, to Angie's family and friends, to the community. Thank you.
Mr. Dripps, you have the right to make a statement. Is there anything you would like to say?
It'll be brief, really. I'd just like to say that I am sorry. Didn't intend for this to happen. I can't imagine what grief I've caused over the last 25 years. I'm not even imagining if it was one of my own. I can't even imagine. Can't even imagine what it would be like. But at the end of the day, it's not the same as what the reality is, what pain and hardship I've caused. Wish we would have a chance at a do-over, because I would do over that day. Never would have gone over to that apartment. I just wish I could do over that night. I'm sorry. I know you never forgive me, but I am sorry. I don't know what to say. I just know it's not right. I'm sorry.
All right, appreciate the recommendations, comments, the victim impact statements. They're all very helpful. Factors I consider in sentencing are protection of society, deterrence, punishment, rehabilitation. I would say that punishment's the primary focus on this type of sentencing. Of course, I reviewed the pre-sentence report. It is, accurate, except for a very horrific and unconscionable crime, relatively crime-free. So I'm not necessarily looking at rehabilitating a career criminal, but it is a crime worthy of some significant punishment. 25 years is a long time to wait for some type of closure on such a crime, on such a brutal crime. And only due to some advancements in technology and good police work are we here today, which could pin the DNA to the suspect, defendant, and ultimately the convicted felon for this crime. Again, you look at crimes like this, and it's impossible to quantify how much damage has been caused. And it's spread wide. I particularly like Mr. Dodge's comment that it's chaos. It's chaos for a lifetime. You look at the trauma, psychological trauma caused by this to a loved one, and your life is upended in turmoil and chaos. A young man spent a significant part of his life in prison for no good reason. He was innocent. That falls on you. So a lot of things to look at. Perhaps the focal point of the sentencing is plea agreement. I think a judge needs to give significant deference to a plea agreement, particularly when it's negotiated by a mediator. The attorneys work hard towards trying to find some common ground. A lot of factors go into a mediation, into what might ultimately be a plea agreement. So I think it's a little perhaps arrogant for a judge to second guess those factors, second guess the driving aspects and basis of the plea agreement. So I've always believed that those types of agreements should be given deference. They're not always absolute, not always agreeable, and do not hardly ever satisfy everybody concerned. And that's just the nature of criminal proceedings, mediations, and plea agreements. Under the circumstances, and I would agree with counsel, certainly the medical testimony, the medical evidence would have an effect on a sentencing, this sentencing or any other. I think that's an important factor for a judge to consider sentencing. In this case, it's perhaps a little more important than usual because as perhaps draconian as that sounds, we are contemplating life expectancy and what's an appropriate punishment for someone with a diminished life expectancy. Frankly, you look at this crime and say the defendant deserves to spend the rest of his life in jail. I would agree with that. But then we come down to, well, what's the definition of the rest of his life? So obviously that was the driving factor in this plea agreement. All things being said, I am going to follow the plea agreement in this matter. The sentence on count 1 will be life, minimum of 20 years, so 20 years fixed. Count 2 will be life with a minimum of 20 years. Sentences will run concurrent, receive credit for time served. There'll be a fine of $5,000 on each count. Defendant is required to comply with the Idaho Sex Offender Registration Act. Court costs and victims relief fund will be assessed at the standard amount. Any questions on that, Mr. Archibald?
No, thank you.
Ms. Queen, do you have any questions about it?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Drips, do you have any questions about the sentencing today? All right, if nothing else, we can recess.
Judge, I have one more thing.
Go ahead.
Sorry. I will be filed on my court, but this is a copy of, to add addendum to the pre-sentence of the slides in the presentation. And the pre-sentence investigator did not upload all of the medical records. I have them on a thumb drive, so I'm delivering that.
All right, so that'll be a separate submission, you're saying?
Yes, addendum to pre-sentence investigation, so it'll stay under seal.
All right, fair enough. If nothing else, we'll be in recess. Thank you.